Welcome to the show, Justin Yoon. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Robin.
Great. Well, I'll start with a quick introduction for you. So, Justin is the founder of Alphasys, a Salesforce consulting partner that specializes in the nonprofit industry. Alphasys is an award-winning Salesforce consulting partner and Sage Intacct partner. Alphasys designs and delivers sustainable systems that enable for-purpose organizations to achieve their social goals. They specialize in fundraisers, charities, program case management, volunteer programs, RTOs, colleges, associations, and K through 12 schools. His role is to understand the why behind their for-purpose clients, challenge operating models, people, processes, and data that supports that why, and then design technology solutions to enable it. He works with industry leaders to identify future opportunities, challenges, and trends, so his consultants can provide future-focused advice and help for purpose leaders navigating the uncertainty of running an organization. More recently, Justin founded a Salesforce ISV called Posamente, which builds solutions on top of the Salesforce platform for the for-purpose sector. The company was initially founded as student wellbeing software and has later expanded to include fundraising, payments processing, and K through 12 education. His role is to leverage industry learnings through the Alphasys consulting practice to provide a vision for innovation in their targeted subverticals. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Thanks, Robin.
Great. Well, let's get started. I think the first question is, what inspired you to focus on the nonprofit industry?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. For me, I've always been someone who is led by wanting to do something with meaning. And so, my career actually started in some may perceive as the opposite type of sector, financial services. They're not all bad, but I did a lot of work within the consultancy world, working with banks, investment management firms, superannuation organizations. And I got to see how they ran and operated. And I could see also how well they managed risk and controls and drove efficiencies and even ran projects mostly pretty well in a way that would help them run better as a business. But for me, I've got a faith, and that's kind of what connects me to that for-purpose sector. But I've also seen a lot of need around my realm in terms of people with mental health challenges, medical challenges, and the like. And I've always wondered, how can I bridge that gap? How can I take those learnings that I've had from working in this consulting area within a quite well-run industry and bring it to these nonprofit type organizations who may not have the same kind of budget know-how to be able to achieve their impact through technology and good operations. And so for me, there became that switching moment of going, I love the work I do, but I'm not necessarily passionate about the group that I'm doing it with. And so about 6-7 years ago, that's when we as Alphasys made that call. Let's switch our focus and only work on the for-purpose sector. Yeah, for us, we would love to understand the mission of our clients before we even talk the technology. That ability to go, what is that mission? It's more than shareholder value, but also profit's not bad. And so we are taking a lot of those financial services learnings and going, let's aim for profit, but for the sake of achieving the mission in a much better way. It's a real thrill to be able to do this on a daily basis where you can get out of bed in the morning knowing each and every day the work that you're doing is driving towards making the world a better place.
That's great. And it must be also for your team as well, working with your clients. They must have a shared passion for that kind of sector as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing whereby quite often it's almost everyone that we interview will say they're passionate about the sector. But often when we ask follow-up questions such as, if you had $100 ready to donate, where would you give it to? And it's quite funny how many don't actually have an idea of what they're passionate about, what they're interested in, or able to articulate what it is about the nonprofit sector that they're passionate about. And so rather than it being people are here and then become passionate, it's actually a little bit the opposite way. It's about we've hired people that already had a passion for the sector. And so for us as an organization, we're a fulfillment of that passion as opposed to the creator of it.
That's great. So it really allows them to live with purpose and achieve that ikigai sense.
Yeah, we love ikigai as a comment, although my wife did tell me that in Japanese culture, they don't see that word in exactly the same way. But hey, let's not let the truth get in the way of a good story.
That's right. Us Westerners, we'll just take anything. That's great. All right, well, let's jump into the next question. What are the major challenges facing nonprofits in fundraising today?
Look, it's probably an answer that changes every 6 to 12 months in the current environment. I'd probably suggest that if you asked me this question pre-COVID, there was already a huge disparity in terms of people's ability to raise funds. Some were better at digital than others. Others relied heavily on face-to-face acquisition. But in that kind of post-COVID world, it forced all the, let's say, legacy-style charities to just up their game because there were no longer those face-to-face type channels available to them to raise funds. But then even since then now, we've hit an economic challenge whereby cost of living pressures have gone up. The people don't have that excess cash in their wallet to spend. And as a result, everyone is fighting for the same donor dollar, where that donor dollar is now shrinking in terms of the available pool. Now, what we've been hearing in the market is that while let's say the individual giving segment of fundraising has become a challenge for some, that major giving segment, those that do have kind of deeper pockets, they've been extremely generous in filling that gap. But what it means is that there is so much more emphasis in good relationships and good understanding. And so, we now live in a world whereby we're all struggling to afford sometimes day-to-day provisions. We also live in a hyper-personalized world where I don't want to receive anything that's just generic in nature that comes to me. And if you have an ask of me, I'm not just going to give it to you willy-nilly. I need to know exactly how that dollar that I'm giving you is going to contribute to that end goal. And I think this is where the fundraising market will experience challenges, and is already experiencing challenges. How can we connect how the money gets spent in delivering outcomes and connect it back into good messaging to encourage that next donation or a longer term relationship? In reality, for most organizations, they have a lot of disparate systems. They'll have one fundraising system, a case management system, a separate system to do outcomes measurement, and much difficulty trying to glue that whole loop together in order to communicate that right message to knowing that here's Robin, here's what he's interested in, here's how he's been impacted by the cause that we are supporting, here's where Robin gave his money to, here's how we spent his money, here's what we achieved with it, and therefore communicating a hyper-personalized message back to Robin using all of that information. Once they nail it, though, what an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, and while it's more difficult for fundraisers, it's almost forcing the right change, because nonprofits, they do need to be accountable to their donors. They do need to make sure that money is spent well. They do need to provide traceability of where that fundraising money is going. So it almost like COVID, it wore out the businesses that weren't really good businesses. Like the businesses that were struggling already really struggled during COVID, and many of them aren't around anymore. It's the same thing now with the recession, is that it's going to weed out the nonprofits that didn't really have their ducks in a row and weren't able to deliver that true impact for that donor dollar, and may have been wasteful with it. So while it's difficult, it's a good opportunity for the good nonprofits to actually thrive.
Yeah, I do think this current environment is actually arguably more difficult than COVID, because at least during COVID there was JobKeeper. There was a way to help kind of sustain staff, and there was that willingness to utilize cash on the balance sheet to invest in projects. Whereas we are seeing a little bit of a cash shortage, or a reluctance to invest right now, given the uncertainty of the economy and no equivalent of JobKeeper to keep us sustained on an ongoing basis.
And so that's a challenge in itself, right? Because these nonprofits, they have to balance what you described before around providing that traceability from the donor dollar all the way through to the impact and then back to them. They've now got to balance the change required to deliver that with also a very cautious eye on their P&L.
Absolutely. And I think the temptation is to try and do more activity. So maybe let's start introducing more face-to-face acquisition. Let's start introducing more telemarketing. Now, these are not wrong things to do in its individual kind of activities that you're doing. But what's the strategy? What are we trying to achieve? And so rather than offering new product lines or trying to attract more segments, you're spread quite thinly when you're trying to do too many things. Versus, I really like that analogy of the same amount of energy that is in a laser beam spread widely will have much less of an impact.
Mm.
And so, if we know there are finite dollars available for investment, how do we really have that laser focus on the right segments that align to what our cause is, based also on what we currently have in terms of a critical mass in, let's say, donor type or profile? How do we go really hard at that group and do it better, as opposed to trying to go wider and try and attract donors that we've never attracted before?
Yeah, having that real focus. I'm also, and I want to talk about this in a bit more detail, but I'm also seeing data security as a major issue that's facing many nonprofits. While they have limited funds to ensure they have the systems in place to automate their data processing, they also have this massive threat of data breach and external players trying to get in. And last year alone, there were a number of data breaches in the nonprofit sector that have really put a spotlight on the whole risk and the practices that these nonprofits face. Because if there's a data breach, it really reduces the amount of trust that these donors have in giving their data to the brand.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Quite often, when we work with organisations in the non-profit and health sectors, the number one questions that get asked is, "Where's my data stored? And does my data get transmitted outside of Australia?" And so, a lot of energy and emphasis is put in by IT teams, compliance teams, in ensuring that the combination of systems that they have doesn't have any data looping outside of Australia as a country. But that same scrutiny isn't necessarily always put in terms of, and who are the third-party providers that we provide the data to, how are they managing the data? And I would suggest that data stored overseas, not that we're advocating for it, but data stored overseas by a reputable vendor who will ensure it's secure is always a better result to an Australian data store through a third party where there aren't the same levels of controls in place. And so we need to think about data security less just about ticking the box of where is it and what have you, but also really thinking about who's handling it, how are they handling it, what are the retention policies that exist if data is being stored, and ensuring that there are good practices all around. But that's becoming tougher and tougher to do in this market. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts, but there's that tension. Is it we need to invest more in systems to do everything ourselves? Does it mean we shouldn't use third parties? Or what's that best approach to have when it comes to having third party vendors supporting us in our growth?
Yeah, and it's a really good point. I think there's a lot of dependency on third-party providers that do outbound calling on behalf of the nonprofit, or they do the annual tax appeal fundraising campaigns, and they do it really well. And they've got the strategy, they've got the creative, they've got the content. They also take the data off the hands of the nonprofit and target those people. And there's a massive risk in doing that, where maybe they aren't sending the data back, like the unsubscribed data or the feedback and response data, to the nonprofit. So the nonprofit doesn't really have a long-term view on what's going on. They're also not deleting the data, as you mentioned, after the campaign happens. They keep the data on file, which just opens everyone up for that data breach. And there's been notable data breaches last year where many large brands that are household names have had their data breached. So I think the key is really to ensure that the strategy is provided by those experts, but to have a very careful eye on exactly where the data is going. And ideally, if you can execute the campaigns on your own platforms where you have full control over that data, rather than ship it off to their systems, even if it seems secure for them to execute, it's much better if you can execute it with your technology.
Yeah, I think there's always this kind of cost benefit analysis that needs to take place. So I know a lot of our clients have tried to encourage, or let's say even force their third-party suppliers to use their systems instead of sending data out. But the cost that then gets quoted to them is so significant, it becomes quite challenging to take that approach. But then I guess, what is the cost of a data breach?
That's
and
right.
What's that return on investment in relative terms? And I think a similar thing happens in the payment sector. So when we look at the payment sector, there are a number of organizations that still want to store the credit card details on a spreadsheet we've seen before, or in even in Salesforce. Even though Salesforce is a secure system, we just wouldn't recommend it. But what they want to do is to be able to download their batch file and upload into a bank in order to do the direct debits, and because it saves them, let's say 0.5% on every transaction. But for me, the question is always, but geez, if there is a data breach or anything goes wrong, that cost is going to be 100-fold what you're saving on an annual basis. Is it really worth that risk? And so I think that's a tension that will always exist. The ideal will always be more expensive, but then is it worth the risk?
And maybe that's a good segue. Posamente provides payment processing and transactions. How have you dealt with that data security risk with Posamente?
Yeah, so building payment processing products on the Salesforce platform is not something new for us. And 5 to 10 years ago, every payment gateway really operated the same, except maybe the quality of their integration, the speed at which they operated was a little better. And so it would be that Salesforce or the CRM would have to own the schedule, drive the charging, and you go to the gateway and there's all these back and forth kinds of things, including the tokenization. You need to temporarily store the credit card on a web page or in Salesforce, send it over to the gateway to get securely tokenized and bring it back. But there's always that little snippet of risk that exists, and that was just something we had to accept in the technology sector. What we've now seen is a lot of innovation happening in the payment space in response to these challenges. And so for us, we unashamedly really love working with Stripe, not necessarily because of Stripe's fees. We do know it's a bit more expensive. What we do love about it is the fact that we can embed Stripe elements inside of any web page whereby we never hold the credit card. Stripe gives us all of those elements that take the credit card information, immediately does those tokenization or payment attempts, and then gives us the end result only, so that we don't have to handle the credit card information. We're still going to always have that tension point. We do get often asked, but we want to use this gateway. We got really good rate, but the security of those gateways is great in there, but it still pushes a lot of the effort and energy to our clients. And we just don't see our clients having the capacity to go through such a complex PCI compliance review in which they're owning the infrastructure and having to harden it from a security perspective. We'd much rather say, let the specialists be specialists at that, and let the charity focus on being a great charity.
That's a really great point. What do you see around the literacy of the charities in terms of that data security element, especially around the financial payment processing side?
I'd probably suggest it's something that they all know, that the sector knows is a risk and a problem. There isn't really strong education around the place to help people be better in this area. And so I guess the risk is around limited resources, limited capacity. I'm worried about it, but I've got no choice in the matter. We are starting to see a lot more IT teams having security specialists in there, but it does require that charity to then have a critical mass. There are a ton of third-party providers as well who do exist in providing those consultancy services that just help advise on how to be more secure. And it's finding those right trusted partners in that scenario where you can't do it in-house, where you know that they know enough to be able to help you be secure. The thing, though, is that with risk, you can't outsource risk, because in the end, you're the one that cops it if something goes wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of these nonprofits, they have a history of dealing with partners that traditionally have just done the job. And there's probably a lot of trust in those partners. But unless you have full visibility of what the partners are doing and you've assessed and qualified their data security practices, you are outsourcing the risk to the partner. So it is really important that you either have a very clear understanding of their appetite for risk and their security practices, and if they've got a CISO, great. And if they're aware of it and on the front foot, great. But if they're not, and if you haven't qualified them, then it's really the director's liability, and their diligence is required around this topic. And so I feel it's very important for the directors of the organization to be aware and to ensure they gain literacy in data security.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I used to work in the risk and compliance sector back when I was in the consulting world. It's very complex, and there aren't that many people who know it really well. But one of the key roles that I had, I actually worked in one of the banks as well, where my job was to be in the business to upskill and train them on how to understand risk and how to understand what controls mean and how to implement those controls to ensure that the key risks were being addressed. And so it's as much as it is a difficult topic and it's not the most interesting topic for many, definitely risk managers weren't the most exciting people necessarily to have a beer with. It is so critical to the success of an organization. And yeah, I think in the financial services sector, you see it so often that something wrong happens and immediately the risk team gets a ton of investment and gets built up. But as times are good, risk just kind of whittles away until something goes wrong. And I'd much rather it being constant. We don't have any big fluctuations like this, but we're just constantly thinking about risk as part of your day-to-day. And even for us we're not a huge business, but we've implemented our own risk framework. We've implemented identifying where are those key risks and what are the controls that we need to do. It wasn't the most fun conversations to have internally, but we see how important risk management is, not just as a business, but also the way that we look after our clients.
Yeah, it's one thing I really enjoy about working with Salesforce is they do take care of a lot of that risk. The basics of data security are controlled within the platform.
That trust.salesforce.com, right? Just
absolutely.
Go there and have a look at the trove of resources.
That's right. And they've got added features like Salesforce Shield, and they've got a zero trust architecture so that when it is connected correctly, it is actually very secure, and there's alerts to your admins when the APIs aren't maintained properly. And the ISV network, as far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have to go through security checks, similar to an iPhone application has to go through security checks before you can become an approved partner.
Oh, it's very tough. It's an annual review, so an upfront review to first be even allowed to be listed on the platform with very high thresholds in terms of vulnerability tests and the like. It takes quite a while actually to go through that process. And once you've got it, every year you've got to go through a recertification process just to ensure that you're maintaining those standards. And as a ISV, it's a pain because it's a lot of work. But what it also does mean is that our clients can trust everything that's on there because of the fact that there's such rigor in the process.
Yeah. I think trust is a really good word, and it's great. It's a very important word for the non-profit industry because you need to be trusted with that donation. You need to be trusted with that data. You need to be trusted to fulfill that mission objective that your organization has as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Awesome. What role does legislation and compliance play in shaping the fundraising strategy for nonprofits?
It's an interesting one. It's probably not so clear at the moment in some parts. So FIA, which is a key leader of the Fundraising Institute of Australia, they drive a code of conduct as part of their membership, whereby it's not legislative in nature. It's almost like a creed to say, hey, this is what good practice looks like. And they need to ensure that all or as many charities as possible are complying with that code of conduct. It just takes one bad charity, one to go rogue, which just brings the whole sector down. They're very important in terms of maintaining the skill level, the understanding, but also the quality of the sector. But in terms of then compliance itself, it's probably a bit more murky still. It's in terms of there's not as much that's directly in the nonprofit space. There have been scenarios where new policies have come in that made it impossible for the nonprofit sector to operate. And so I think one example of that was around regular schedules. You needed to be able to send an email for every recurring invoice, let's say, if you're a gym, to just remind them that direct debit was coming, things like that, a lot more kind of opt-in scenarios. But what it meant was the amount of overhead that would result in for a charity was going to render them kind of impossible to manage. And so there were a few provisions made for the nonprofit sector, thankfully, but that's where legislation often comes in, where it's thinking in a much more broad sense without necessarily understanding the unique needs of the charity sector. Another one that's looming is around what the Australian GDPR equivalent is going to look like. It's still a bit kind of in progress at the moment. It's not been landed yet, but from all accounts, it seems like it's even more difficult than what GDPR looks like overseas. And so there's a lot of uncertainty once again in terms of what that would mean. Maybe the final area of legislation, I'd love to hear what you're hearing, Robin, from a marketing perspective, but one is around that face-to-face acquisition side and kind of spam acts as well with telemarketing. In the UK, face-to-face acquisition is a lot more difficult to do now. We're not sure what that looks like in the Australian market going forward.
Yeah, there is some exceptions in terms of spam with Australian nonprofits where they don't have to respect the do not call register, which private commercial companies do have to respect. So there's some exception. Also the unsubscribes, it's a little bit looser for nonprofits, but it doesn't mean that they shouldn't care about it. And I think that legislation will change, especially if there's bad actors. So I think, if anything, nonprofits have to be very respectful of the preferences that customers or their donors give them and say, I do want to be part of this. I don't want to be part of that. I don't want to call, don't call me, stop calling me. As you said before, Justin, it kind of, if you have one bad actor, it gives the whole industry a really bad name. And you don't want people to not answer their phone call because they've just had too many calls from a nonprofit and they've registered for the do not call list. So I think it's really important to, regardless of whatever law or exception there is, to actually behave as a exceptional corporate citizen and set a good example for other nonprofits.
Yeah, it's almost that question of what's the purpose of these compliance rules and laws is not red tape. It's actually to protect citizens of a country. And so if that's the mindset, as a charity, it's thinking, what do our clients, what do our donors, our volunteers, our supporters need and want? How do we care for these citizens that support us or we hope will support us one day? And the compliance legislation and policies and code of conduct are a minimum bar as opposed to how do we push the boundaries as much as we can. So for me, I'm all about a client-centric approach where then we validate against the different acts and code of conducts out there just to ensure that we're not breaching any.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it comes back to data. If you have a full view of your supporter, you can see what they've volunteered for. You can see the history of their donations, if they're a regular giver, if they're a major donor, if they have been involved in a bequest or a conflict with a bequest. All of that information becomes very critical in personalizing campaign to them to raise more funds. Because you don't want to ask them for money if they've had a bad experience or if they already give you a lot, because it just leaves a sour taste and you can really damage that relationship. And one person that's unhappy, that word of mouth does spread, like it spreads like wildfire. So it's really important to just be exceptional with your data and awareness of that supporter, and how you communicate them should be as if you're communicating to a person that you know very well, an individual, not as a group of people or a cohort.
Yeah, absolutely. We often talk to our clients about the concept of a flywheel. So I don't know if you've heard this concept, but it's Amazon has a flywheel which kind of looks at the idea of you have cheaper prices, it gives you more sales. More sales means we can invest in our infrastructure or grow our market in terms of suppliers who are selling on our marketplace, which then drives lower prices. And by driving lower prices, it means that we get more customers. And this cycle, it's hard to start. It's hard to begin like a flywheel. You're pushing it and pushing it. It takes a lot of energy and effort. But once the momentum is built, it actually becomes harder to slow it down or even stop it because there is so much momentum going on in that flywheel. And so that's really where nonprofits are heading to and need to head to in order to be effective. We need to raise resources. Resources could be funds, it could be volunteer hours, it could be petition votes. We raise those resources that all gear towards helping us address a mission. How do we deliver good programs or services or give them money to great researchers, for example, who will make breakthroughs? How do we measure those outcomes of how that money has been used? And from there, we then feeds back into communicating and knowing our stakeholders better. And that's kind of what you were just alluding to there, Robin. Once I know so much about my stakeholder, where they volunteered, how they've been impacted by our cause, what they've given, maybe even where we directly delivered service, we know so much about them that we can personalize that experience and use it as a way to then raise more resources. And then that cycle keeps on going. But at the middle of it, you need to have trust. If you don't have trust in that middle, if we break that trust, the flywheel will just roll away and disappear, smash to 1,000 pieces. And so to us, that's what we're excited by. This whole concept of just keeping going round and round, building that momentum, but we can't sacrifice that trust in them.
Yeah, that's a really great point. In terms of that, understanding the different relationships with that supporter or the client, how they've contributed to the charity, how do you see the internal departments working together or sometimes working against each other in terms of communicating? Do you see conflicts internally with the nonprofit teams?
Great question. We haven't even discussed this one, but this is one of my lovely pet topics. One of the things that I really struggle with is we have seen organizations where the person who owns a relationship doesn't want that person to go to a campaign or event that is being run by another team. Because if their donor gives money to that event or that campaign, they won't be recognized. It won't hit their KPIs. And to me, that's just such a conflict of interest. Suddenly you have, let's say, a major giving manager who refuses to let any of their relationship managed donors go to that great event that would have unlocked their wallet simply because they're not going to get KPI. And so the challenge is that we're operating, these organizations are operating off a very static, maybe single dimension type approach to attribution of KPI metrics or of revenue. But to me, I prefer to almost double count the money, to be able to say who owns a relationship, who is owning the strategy around these group of people, the actual owners per se of the person. What are the vehicles through which we can unlock their wallets or get their hours or whatever the metric is that we're measuring there. And we want them to collaborate together to go, hey, I've got all these major givers. If you can run a golf day at that location at this time, I can get so many people there to then drive more dollars to our cause. Can you help me? And they say, yes, we can. And they together work on that event. And they result in raising funds that both teams get the KPIs of congratulations, you've done well. And so for me, that's something that I'm really trying to push, and I'm seeing a lot more of our clients starting to move that direction as well, to recognizing the difference between who owns that relationship versus who owns the channel. Now, with the relationships in the philanthropic team, it becomes a bit easier, right? You've got your bequest manager, your major giving manager, your corporate manager. But what about then the individual gift section? Well, maybe that's more strategic in nature. That's saying we've got someone who's the individual giving manager who's focused on those that are not yet directly relationship managed as a one-to-one person. And then they're thinking about strategies. Hey, marketing, can you help me unlock ways to get cash, get funds out of this group of people? So it's still the same approach. It's just that in some cases it's more mass market ownership, and in other cases it's more one-to-one ownership in that more high-touch giving.
Yeah, that's a really great insight. And I see exactly the same thing where they're like, no, I own it. I own the relationship because they generate funds and we need those funds for the organization. And because we generate more funds than you generate, we're more important. So we get the priority. But as you say, it's just one human at the end that just wants to help the mission. And we want to help them help the mission in whatever way they want to help the mission. If that's in volunteering or attending events or being an advocate online, whatever it is, it's more important that they help holistically in the way that's comfortable to them than we target them with just one intention of I want your regular donation. So yeah, that's really interesting. How do you see the technology playing a role in bringing those teams together?
It means that we don't have a flat structure anymore. So the way that the data architecture of, let's say, Salesforce is done is that we have a separation between the who owns the person, what was the donation channel in which it was given, the credit cash check, and which campaign brought it in. And so it means that we have that ability to do really good reporting, slicing and dicing. And as an organization changes its business structure, we don't have to change the underlying data. All the underlying data is there. We're simply applying a new lens over the top. And so more and more we're seeing our clients taking on a data analyst or those type of roles where they're using Tableau over the top to try and really dissect that data. And it means that those good, meaningful reports can go to the management team to measure performance. I think historically, the fundraising systems that existed, very hard to get data out of it, very static in their approach, and we couldn't do that slicing and dicing easily. And because reporting was so difficult, it was actually easier to send all the data into the finance system and let finance drive reporting. But of course, then finance is reviewing everything on a cost center basis, as opposed to different dimensions necessarily. Not to say it's deliberate, it's not bad intention. It's just simply the way that a lot of the finance systems have been set up. And so I think, the modern world is to say, hey, let finance focus on finance and financial reporting and yes, cost center management. But how do we do a lot of the KPI measurement more out of CRM because all the data is there in good structures that allows where we can use standard reporting or business intelligence tools to be able to extract and understand what we're seeing from a performance, our behaviors, as segments.
Yeah, that's a great point. Your finance system is often the truest source of truth in a nonprofit because that's where the dollars get counted. But you're right, you have all of these other systems in most nonprofits. You may have peer-to-peer applications that are sitting over there. You may have an email marketing tool sitting over there. You may have your agency that has their own tools that are doing SMS campaigns or outbound calling campaigns. All of those responses and engagement, unless that's reported on, you can't create a single view. You can't then analyze it and say, where have we made the impact across our supporter base? You're limited to just that financial data, which is just one slice of the pie. It's really a limited view, and it really limits the marketing and fundraising teams from being able to segment that actual transactional data to drive the best campaigns. I'd much rather know if someone has done a peer-to-peer campaign and had really great engagement and what they've actually done and how many supporters they had than just see the dollar amount that they generated in my finance system, because that doesn't tell me that much and I can't encourage them to do more of that great work.
It's a really interesting thing whereby I think historically the only way to get that single view, given all the number of systems that you mentioned and more, was to have a data warehouse. Let's just dump all the data that we have, dump it into a data warehouse, and then we can once every 3 months, every 6 months, analyze it, extract it, create segments, and apply those segmentation rules into our core donor management system that will last in the next 3 to 6 months until we rerun the query again. But modern systems are a lot more accessible, where you can use APIs to get data en masse, bulk APIs to get huge amounts of records out in nanoseconds. These kind of tools exist. But also, with the data warehouse, you need to come up with a structure. You need to figure out what is the database structure that we want to have to host it all. And that becomes quite challenging to do because you'll design a structure that works for the right now, how our current team is structured, for example. But then when the business changes or you want to see a new lens, I'm so stuck because of the rigidity of that warehouse. And so then, people are moving to data lakes where it's just going to shut the data in. But we're just adding more sinks and more kind of technical debt in an organization to make it work. I'm really excited by things like Data Cloud that are coming out, which stitches those data together, whereby if you can access the data directly from the source, great. But of course, if you can't, we do need to use something in the middle like a data lake. But as much as possible, let's go straight to the source. Let's glue that data together, stitch it together in a model and a profile. And then when we change our business, that's okay. We just change the model. We don't have to change the underlying data that supports it. And it just means that then innovation can be driven. We can think about hypotheses. Hey, this is what we believe is true. Let's check whether the data supports it. Let's do a test campaign, do something with that data, and we can then change the model or change our campaign approach depending on the results that we get.
And from a marketer perspective, if I've got Justin, who is he's done a peer-to-peer campaign, so I've got Justin with his Gmail address, then I've got his work email address in my fundraising platform, and I've got maybe his wife's email address in my marketing tool. It's really hard to understand who that person is and what they've done. I can't understand maybe even that's your wife, you share the same last name, and maybe you reuse the same email address. So having a system and even a data warehouse, it struggles to do that kind of matching where I can really form one true identity or the golden record concept for Justin and for his family. So that's where a platform like Data Cloud really plays a massive role in just stitching those different identities across those different systems together, so that when I do automate my marketing to them and I want to personalize the messaging en masse, I can do it with confidence. I don't have to worry. I don't want to say too much because I may get it wrong. I may say, oh, Justin, thank you for your first and only donation last month. It's great that we have you as a new supporter to our charity, but you've been donating through your wife for the last 10 years, or maybe just with a different email address. So this concept of throwing data into a data lake and building a segment, it's not good enough for marketers to truly do their job with trust again.
And it's too late too. In many cases, we've heard scenarios where someone didn't meet, let's say, the major gift threshold during the time that the query was run, but because the next query is run 6 months later, when they make a donation that finally pushes them over the major giving threshold, needs another 6 months to pass before they get at it. And so it's not real time enough for the organization to really recognize those amazing people that are supporting them. But look, this whole concept of stitching it all together, it's got so many applications, right? Like we've got marketing, but you've got your analytics that you need to be able to do over the top to make those right informed strategic business decisions. But you've also got generative AI, and I know that it's still a bit like, how's that going to work? But geez, can you imagine that we stitch together that profile and we know all the different variants of that individual on that one individual profile, where we can then now generate that personalized letter? It all goes back to that first point we talked about. We need really hyper personalization communications, interactions, and the like to make it possible for us to show we know them and we care for them and we have our client, our donors, our volunteers, our supporters' best interests.
Absolutely. I like to think about personalization from a very one-to-one perspective. Like imagine if you had a nonprofit and you just had the one supporter, how would you treat them? That's how you'd want to treat a supporter in an organization that has millions of supporters, is really knowing them, knowing their interests, knowing why they donate, knowing the history of all of the support they provided and everything they've ever done for you. Knowing everything about them allows you to have a very personal and empathetic conversation with them. And it's empathetic because you're not just throwing spaghetti at the wall at them and they're not receiving this comm that's like, hey, first name, like, thank you for your support. Please support us some more. And that's it. Like you do want to have a very personal conversation. With AI, generative AI, it is going to allow a very human conversation to happen, but the data needs to be correct for AI to use. If the data is not correct, the foundations aren't right, AI is going to spit out some stuff that you may not trust that generative process as much as if you had the data all in order, ready for it to consume. A generative AI won't fix the data problem. It may help it, it may enrich it, but it's really up to the organization to get their data right before they start doing heavy generative AI content.
Yeah, it's not just about getting the data right. It's kind of really strong business rules as to, we talk about this stitching together of the multiple identities into one profile, but maybe someone doesn't want that. For example, for me, I like to keep my personal person separate to my business person, even with the same vendor in some cases, because that's about work and that's about my home life. And so it's bound to respect that individual as well through our business rules that determine, do we have permission to stitch the different identities that they have together or not? And so there's a lot of questions that keep coming up with our workshops with clients where those business rules haven't been thought through simply because they've never been possible before. But I guess in this world that we are currently in and going forward, more and more organizations would be so clear on these rules as to when do I count them as the same person? How do I unify identities in a good way? And how do I split identities in a good way when necessary?
Yeah, more and more, I think ethics is playing a massive role in technology, data, how we go to market, because you've got to consider the why and the what's the right thing. How do we do the right thing by the supporter? How do we respect what their needs and wants are? And it really isn't black and white in many cases. And the technology enables us to do anything, but what's right? Which person on the street is the AI car going to kill? That old chestnut. It's the same kind of thing that nonprofits have to start considering. And I think the key to having those conversations is actually understanding. It's understanding the customer at the end of it, but it's also understanding the capability of the technology.
Actually, you raised a really interesting point there. Who owns the customer record? So, all of our clients are seeking that unified record. But let's imagine you have a person who is directly impacted by the health matter that the cause is related to. So let's say a patient. They're also a donor. They're also a volunteer. and they're also on a clinical study
Mm.
that they've enrolled into. Do we trust the person in that clinical study to update the details about me, because that impacts how I'm communicated with by the donation, the fundraising team, and there's all these kind of scenarios that come about. Am I allowed to show this amount of information over there, or what's the right level? And it's really thinking through, when I'm looking at that CRM record of an individual, what am I seeing?
Yeah. And this is hard to do when you have disparate systems and you've got partners that own part of the system. It's a lot easier to do when you have one platform that manages that customer data securely and you can design it in a way that supports those use cases.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What do nonprofit organizations preparing for fundraising CRM RFPs need to know?
That's a very loaded question. We're seeing a lot of a big trend towards using third-party consultants to run an RFP process. And I think that's great, because running an RFP process is hard. There's a lot of organization, a lot of research that's needed, a lot of kind of compliance measures. You want someone independent to run a fair process. I think that's great. But quite often the RFP consultant is also used to do the business analysis work, and maybe they've already got an off-the-shelf set of requirements that they're used to using, and they kind of use them again and again. But what we found is there are some occasions where the requirements that come in as part of an RFP process don't actually reflect the organization, or the organization is struggling to find the resources to really commit to that process, where they're fully outsourcing the knowledge component to a third party. It was interesting because there was an article that's recently come out about Seek transformation versus Metcash, and what it talked through was around, at Metcash it was a certain budget, it went I think 4 times over, whereas Seek went 5 million under. And you go, wait, how was that possible? And it really talked through the concept of true ownership over the transformation. In the Metcash scenario, they relied heavily on third-party consultants. It was all third-party consultants. And it was just this project that sat on the side, just over there, somewhere in the ether, and the business just kept running. A bit of engagement in workshops, but in the hope that one day they're just going to come back with this solution. Ta-da, here you go, just move your whole business over, and it's just going to work. I think we all know intuitively that's going to be a bit of a struggle. But I also get it. It's very hard to do your day job and also run a project on the side. And so where I guess with this RFP process, acknowledging it's more than just finding a vendor, it's finding the way to structure a team that's a mixture of product, of service providers and internal team in order to deliver the outcome together, where that project team includes enough influential and empowered business stakeholders to make it a success. I think quite often the RFP is about, prove to me you can do the job, but not in the context of you with us and the kind of resources we have to be able to make it work. If we view it less of a combative you and us relationship and more about, this is what our team looks like and we need help to supplement our team in order to achieve an outcome, it will result in a better RFP process. It's more relational in nature as opposed to just ticking the box, because in the end, the most perfect person on paper may not have a good rapport and a good connection and a good approach that aligns to the organization, values set, ways of working, and the like.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I totally agree with you. It's when it's just a set of requirements, and the reality is the transformation requires symphony of different stakeholders interacting in a good way together. Not you have to deliver this in this time or there's penalties. It shouldn't be that approach. It should be like, how can we work together to deliver this? What do you need from us? And having the stakeholders that are going to be part of that process really in the detail and the weeds of the RFP. The other thing I see with RFPs is they have an old 90s IT framework applied. It's more like a waterfall way of thinking, where for us to accept this project has gone live, it must meet these requirements. And no sooner than that will we accept it. And that's just not how modern technology transformations work. It actually puts a huge amount of risk into the project by forcing it to get to a percentage of completion before it goes live. Effectively, it's a big bang approach. And that's not the right way to do cloud software. Cloud software is subscription. So the best way of doing it is to get a small use case with the technology that you buy live as soon as possible. and then iterate on top of that and iterate with the requirements in mind. So we like to think about it from a horizon perspective where you say, okay, here's my MVP. Before I go live, it must meet these requirements. But then I've got high level requirements for future phases where I'd like to get to, but I know that it's going to require some learning and maturity of our organization before we really know what we want it to be. And also the technology will change. By the time we get to the end of the first horizon, there's going to be new capabilities and features that we can't foresee at the time of the RFP. Now, if an RFP takes 2 years to complete to achieve that project requirement, it's already set up for failure, in my opinion. So I think there needs to be a fresh way of thinking to RFPs. I don't know exactly what that is, but I think, as you alluded to, it's just more pragmatism. And it's about how do we achieve this together? Is it the right implementation partner? Can we culturally work together? Is it the right technology platform? Has it got longevity that we won't throw it out after 5 years and look for an alternative? So you're really picking the horses and having a good directional view on where you want to go with the horse, but not necessarily saying you have to get there before we will say this is done.
I do agree with you. It's not always that straightforward. So I guess, in the marketing realm where you specialize, absolutely, you've kind of got a really strong base product on a platform. So you got the flexibility of the platform, but you have the off-the-shelf nature of a product whereby you can get the key set up, your key piping of data, the integrations. And once you've got that, you can build your journeys over the top. For some of the transformations we're replacing a system that does everything: finance, HR, website, portal, core CRM, learning. And to try and break it off is very challenging because once you break off one bit, you kind of need everything to be broken off. And so it's not always so clear cut, but we still always do try to find a way with our clients to go, well, what is that minimum, even if we keep the old system in there for a period of time? I guess the challenge is it costs more to take that approach because you're now talking about integrating with the old system as opposed to replacing. And then it takes longer as well to get it done. And there's that worry of change fatigue. There's that worry of, if we break it down too much, are we just never going to get there, kind of thing. The counter side, though, is that from our experience, when you do that massive big bang, analysis paralysis creeps in, probably at the 12-month, 18-month mark, and it becomes a spiral. We need to get everything in there. And so I actually am not fully convinced that the cost savings of taking a big bang approach as quoted initially ends up eventuating, and that perhaps doing the breakdown approach means you're almost guaranteeing it will happen.
And that's where you need people that have done it many times before to balance it. You need to work together, and the RFP consultant, unless they've individually done that project before, it can be difficult for them to understand the potential risks. And every platform vendor has a slightly different approach, but generally cloud CRMs are quite similar. But yeah, I think it requires conversation. It shouldn't be outsourced.
Yeah. The other thing that I think, just on that idea of the list of requirements, it's a very product-centric approach. So let's imagine you're buying an accounting piece of software. You don't really want it to be overly creative. You don't want to be able to do creative accounting. There are certain rules that exist in that industry whereby, here's my accounting system. This is what it's going to do. And maybe the variations that you have are down to the number of dimensions in terms of reporting. It might be the purchase order or the sales order workflows. Those are the parts that you configure. But generally speaking, everything else remains much the same. That's kind of what we're seeing in the P processes. It's taking the approach of buying a product. If that's what you want, don't go for something like Salesforce or Dynamics, which is very flexible in nature, because it's not going to just be a turn it on and it works. But the thing is that don't expect a huge transformation if you're taking a product approach, because it is what it is. And when you want to do something slightly left of center, slightly different, it's going to need you to buy or build something separate, find a way to miraculously integrate with it and make it all work in harmony. Is going to be much harder to innovate and change and grow. And so that's the real tension point that constantly exists. What kind of organization are we? And I do think there are perhaps some organizations that do go down the platform approach that shouldn't, because really they just want to operate a product type of business.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like those point solutions that do the job in the industry really well versus a platform that can do everything you want it to do. But there's also a best way of using it as well and not overly customizing it too. So it's definitely a balance, and it depends on which path you want to take and where your organization's going and what your needs are urgently. Great. Okay, that was a loaded question. What is the difference between Salesforce Nonprofit Success Pack to the new Salesforce Nonprofit Cloud?
How long do we have?
You
Rather
answer
than
that.
look, we're going to first start with the origins of Salesforce. Where did it begin? It began with Mark Benioff looking at how can we make business software as easy to use as Amazon.com at the time. And so it was a business-to-business tool predominantly. The whole structure was about how do I have a sales opportunity, make it as easy as possible to sell to other businesses. And that's why the name Sales Cloud exists, or Salesforce exists as well. Now, the thing is that as part of their DNA, they've always said, we care about this nonprofit sector. It was a part of the core value set, part of the core DNA from day one, which is amazing. But the software didn't really fit in. And so the community kind of banded together to go, well, look, we're getting these free licenses or heavily discounted licenses from Salesforce. How can we build models that will make it possible? And leveraging on this community thinking, Salesforce kind of took charge of it and said, well, let's make this an actual product extension. Let's make a managed package, an app that can be installed on top of Salesforce that turns it from being a business-to-business tool to being something that can help fundraisers raise money. But then it kept morphing and growing. And so over the space of 10 to 15 years, it would add new capabilities like case management, grants management, and the like. But they were all just add-on apps. And they were good, extremely good for what it could do. But it didn't really glue together. And it wasn't on the core platform, meaning it's a third-party app sitting on top. The performance, the scalability of it was not quite as good as what it would have been if it was just built directly in what they call the core Salesforce platform. And so there came this tipping point about 2 years ago where Salesforce was asking the question, do we invest more in this kind of old way of doing things, or are we willing to just rethink what does a good, well-run nonprofit look like? And that's really the decision, was clearly, let's give it another go, using Nonprofit Cloud as the new catalyst for that. And so what are the key things there? It's not a managed package. It's built on the core. It's been designed from the ground up using standard Salesforce capabilities to go, we're not going to build shortcuts around it. Let's just do it properly from the ground up to make it as easy as possible to manage everybody. So not just donors, but volunteers, clients, funders, and the like. Everybody is all managed in that one place where we have that single record of an individual knowing all of the touch points that are around. Now, the part that has been really good about Nonprofit Cloud is that they're a part of what they call the industry cloud family. And so Salesforce have realized that our generic platform at the bottom has been great. It's served an amazing job for the fueling the growth that they've been seeing. But now the market demands somewhere that's not a full point solution product, but it's not a full just development platform. How do we get that middle ground? And so this is where Industry Cloud came in, which was to say, let's come up with some templates, some capabilities, finance, health, media and telecommunications, public sector. How do we build these kind of points of view directly on top of this core platform, built in the core platform, but specific to industries that we're targeting, of which education and nonprofit are two of those. And so they've really thought from the ground up, embedding it in and leveraging as much as they can from these other industry cloud solutions to go, what have they learned? What have they learned? And let's get the best of what's already been learned and put it into there. And so, I mean, sometimes people ask, how on earth can you build such a massive product in just 1 year? Well, in actual fact, the amount they had to build was quite minimal because they used a whole raft of components that already existed in this industry cloud area. And so, yes, they did have to build out a few program management, case management module components, but it did use a lot from the health cloud and public sector cloud industry solutions. Fundraising was built from the ground up, which is why it took about 6 months longer to get out there. But I've met their product team, amazing bunch who've worked in the industry for over 20 years, worked in some of the market leading competitors for a number of years. And they've taken that knowledge, rethought about it, and put it into the product. And so this is what, one is definitely a lot more modern, built from the ground up, thinking about what's best, extremely scalable, and lots of componentry borrowed or stolen from other industries to make it work so well in that nonprofit sector. But I don't want to discount what NPSP is an amazing solution that's been built, 15 years worth of knowledge shoved into there, but it is a bit older, and I would suggest we'll start transitioning kind of out over time.
That was a great answer. Justin is also one of the leading partners in the world with Nonprofit Cloud. It's just been released. When was it released, Justin?
It was released in March last year. That was their program and case management module. Outcomes came out about 3 to 6 months later, and then fundraising came out in October.
Great. And my understanding is you're one of the first partners in the world to implement it.
That's right. So we've been really privileged to be able to have a direct relationship with the Salesforce product team to represent the Australian market. So, when we think about the US, the concept of regular givers, it does exist, but it's definitely nowhere to the degree of what exists in Europe and in Australia. When you've got access to these billionaires with massive foundations that can just dump a few tens of millions into your cause at a time, that's where you're going to focus your energies. But in Australia, definitely regular giving is a massive piece where you need kind of ideally 50,000 plus regular givers to support your cause. And in those type of scenarios, Salesforce's product team maybe weren't as across what some of the nuances were there. And so we had that privilege to be able to work with them on sharing what we've been seeing as best practice locally. There were some European partners as well, all contributing to helping shape the product going forward. And in terms of implementations, we want some of the one of the first partners to definitely sell it, implement it as well, and in particular the fundraising piece that's just come out to use a lot of the new capabilities that have just been released.
That's great, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the Nonprofit Cloud and how that progresses. The $1 million question that all nonprofits are asking is, if I'm already on NPSP, should I migrate to Nonprofit Cloud? What's the recommendation?
Yeah, so look, if NPSP is doing an amazing job for you right now, Salesforce aren't going to get rid of it tomorrow. It's going to continue to be supported. When you've got over 35,000 organizations using NPSP, it'd be pretty silly of Salesforce to just make it unusable overnight. There are some developments that happen in that space, but it's definitely nowhere close to the speed of innovation that is happening in the nonprofit cloud world. And so for me, I'd be recommending, if you're happy with your current NPSP implementation, hold off, keep using NPSP, sweat it out as an asset. Make sure you get your 5 years plus of investment, of return on investment from that implementation, but start thinking about getting ready for a move in that kind of 5 to 10 year horizon. However, if there are some organizations that aren't even on NPSP, they're on the precursor, just being core Salesforce, probably a good time now to start thinking about it. Or maybe you've had Salesforce for a while and you're not really happy with it. It's not really meeting your needs. Maybe you've outgrown the way it was implemented because your organization has changed since it was first implemented. It would be a good time to start thinking about it now. In terms of parity wise, there are some differences. So there are some features in NPSP that are not and probably will not be built in the new world. And so there is a little bit of a gap analysis required to understand what that looks like. But I would suggest that now, as of this February release, we are at better than parity. So not saying that every feature in NPSP now exists in Nonprofit Cloud, but definitely saying it's a better solution overall than NPSP as of the February release.
And if a nonprofit is using NPSP and they did want to migrate to Nonprofit Cloud, what does that look like?
Look, if you're an off-the-shelf NPSP implementation, meaning you've got very few customizations and changes to it, it would mean understanding what you have built out, mapping it through to the new world, and Salesforce are building out and coming out with some migration tools to make it as easy as possible to migrate. And so thankfully, Salesforce is supporting that journey. I guess the thing is that from our experiences, we don't know a lot of nonprofits that haven't done a lot of investing in their platform. They're building out workflows, custom objects, custom fields, maybe their own flows and automations that they've done. And so to recreate those is going to take time. There is no migration of the metadata in terms of the configuration. It's just the migration of the data. Being able to map, here's where it was before, here's where it's going to, and let's help you move it. And so there is no, unfortunately, kind of silver bullet solution to say we just migrate the configuration and off we go. It does need work. And so that's why I'm saying make sure you sweat it out your asset now, because you are going to need to go through a thinking phase of going, what have we learned from in the last 5 to 10 years from our NPSP implementation? Is it, what are the parts that we really liked? What are the parts that we wish we could be better at? And then this is a chance to rethink and reconfigure in the new world. And then we've got the data mapping tools and migration tools that exist from Salesforce to help us map where there's standard objects involved.
And one thing I've heard you mention before is picking use cases. So if you've got, say, fundraising in NPSP, but you're not using it for program case management, maybe look at a nonprofit cloud to do a different use case. So you have both in parallel, and potentially using Data Cloud as a bridge between the two orgs so that you have that single view of the supporter.
Yeah, that's right. So there are a number of organizations that are, let's say, in phase 1 or phase 2 of their transformation. And so if you're in that kind of boat, it is worth just pausing and going, wait a second, if we know that nonprofit cloud is the future, for that phase 3 use case that we were thinking, is it separate enough to justify creating a brand new instance? And then it actually means that, we're not forced into a big bang migration. We've already got the connectivity happening, the framework and infrastructure in place to enable us to then migrate components bit by bit. And so a typical example would be an organization that has led with fundraising in their phase 1. That's already established. But now they're looking at doing program and case management. Oh, the new nonprofit cloud's amazing. So consider, let's get that new instance of nonprofit cloud to do that program and case management. Usually the crossover between the two, 5% of people that are in one and the other. And so if there is a higher number than that, you might want to consider using Data Cloud to surface whatever data is in the fundraising instance and put it into nonprofit cloud. But otherwise, maybe we don't need it. Maybe we can leave them slightly separate because there isn't enough crossover to justify the investment, and we'll just take our time to move functions over if and when we're ready.
Great. That's great advice. Awesome. Well, I think that wraps up our time today, Justin. So I'd like to thank you for being on the podcast, and thank you for all of your insights and valuable tips. Any final words for the audience, and how do people reach you?
Yeah, so look, for us, we'd love to just help organizations make the right decisions. So feel free to reach out to us, hello@alphasys.com.au, or for me, I'm Justin at alphasys.com.au. I would love to just have that conversation. No obligations, even if it's just for advice. Obviously, we'd love to do a project with you, should it lead to that. But really, for us, we just want to be out there evangelizing and helping educate the market on the virtues of nonprofit cloud and how it can help your organization.
Great. Thank you.